The morning sun painted golden streaks across the marble floors of the palace courtyard. Young Marcus Wellington stood near the grand fountain, his designer shoes tapping impatiently against the ancient stones. At 12 years old, he had everything money could buy. His father owned half the commercial buildings in the capital city, and his mother came from old money that stretched back generations. Marcus knew he was special. Everyone told him so. The royal guard stood at attention near the palace gates, their red uniforms crisp and their faces stern. Marcus had walked past them dozens of times during his family's visits to the palace. His father had business connections with several government officials, which meant Marcus often found himself wandering the palace grounds while adults talked about boring things like investments and policies. Today felt different, though. Marcus was in a foul mood. His parents had refused to buy him the latest gaming console, saying he already had 3 at home. The nerve of them. Didn't they understand that his friends would laugh at him for not having the newest model? He kicked a pebble across the courtyard, watching it skitter toward one of the guards. The guard didn't move. He stood like a statue, eyes fixed straight ahead. Marcus found this amusing. He had always wondered what it would take to make these guards break their composure. They looked so serious, so rigid. It seemed like a challenge. Marcus picked up another pebble, slightly larger this time. He tossed it lazily in the guard's direction. It bounced off the man's boot. Still no reaction. The guard remained perfectly still, though Marcus thought he saw a tiny muscle twitch in the man's jaw. A small group of tourists walked past, cameras ready to capture photos of the famous palace guards. Marcus felt a surge of mischief. What if he could make the guard react in front of all these people? That would be something worth bragging about at school. He walked closer, studying the guard's face. The man looked to be in his 30s with a weathered complexion that suggested years of service. His eyes were a pale blue, and despite looking straight ahead, Marcus could tell the guard was very much aware of his presence. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. He opened the camera app and held it right up to the guard's face, snapping several photos with the flash on. The guard's eyes flickered for just a moment, but he maintained his position. The boy laughed. This was actually fun. He had never felt so powerful. Here was this grown man, this trained soldier, and he couldn't do anything while Marcus played his little games. It felt intoxicating. He circled around the guard slowly, making comments under his breath. Comments about the uniform, about how boring it must be to stand there all day, about how the guard probably wasn't smart enough to do a real job. The words came easily to Marcus. He had heard his father talk about employees this way before. People were either useful or they were beneath notice. An elderly woman walking past frowned at Marcus's behavior. She shook her head and muttered something about respect, but Marcus ignored her. What did she know? These guards were paid to stand there. They were basically furniture with heartbeats. Marcus decided to escalate things. He pulled out a candy bar from his pocket, unwrapped it slowly, and began eating it right in front of the guard's face. Crumbs fell onto the guard's pristine uniform. Marcus made exaggerated chewing sounds, waving the chocolate bar back and forth like he was teasing a dog. Still, the guard didn't move. But something had changed in his eyes. They had grown harder, colder. Marcus noticed but didn't care. If anything, it made the game more exciting. He finished the candy bar and casually tossed the wrapper at the guard's feet. Then he pulled out a bottle of water and pretended to accidentally spill some on the guard's boots. The liquid splashed across the polished leather, leaving dark wet marks. A few other palace visitors had stopped to watch. Some looked uncomfortable. Others pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Marcus loved having an audience. He felt like a performer on stage. He started dancing around the guard, making silly faces and gestures. He pulled at the guard's sleeve, testing just how far he could push before getting a reaction. The fabric of the uniform was thick and rough under his fingers. The guard's breathing remained steady, controlled. Marcus grew bolder. He stood directly in front of the guard and began making funny voices, mocking the way military people talked in movies. He saluted sloppily and pretended to march in place. A couple of younger kids in the crowd giggled, which encouraged Marcus even more. What Marcus didn't see was another figure watching from a palace window high above. A woman in elegant clothes observed the scene with narrowed eyes. She picked up a phone and made a brief call. Down in the courtyard, Marcus had found a new game. He started asking the guard ridiculous questions, knowing he wouldn't get answers. Questions about whether the guard had ever fought a dragon, or if his uniform itched, or if he ever got tired of being so boring. Each question was designed to demean, to make the guard feel small. The guard's face had turned slightly red now, though whether from anger or the heat of standing in the sun, Marcus couldn't tell. Either way, the boy took it as a victory. He was getting under the man's skin. Marcus's father had always taught him that power was about control, about making others bend to your will. Right now, Marcus felt powerful. This guard had to stand there and take whatever Marcus dished out. There was something thrilling about that dynamic. Time passed, though Marcus had no idea how much. He was too absorbed in his game. He had progressed to making physical contact now, poking the guard's arm, adjusting his collar, even reaching up to mess with the man's hat. Each touch was a violation of personal space, a test of boundaries. The crowd around them had grown larger. Some people were taking videos. Others were whispering to each other, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. A few parents pulled their children away, not wanting them to see such disrespectful behavior. Marcus didn't notice any of this. His entire world had narrowed to this one guard and his determination to break the man's composure. It had become an obsession. He needed to win this silent battle. He was about to try something even more outrageous when he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy, purposeful footsteps that echoed across the courtyard. Marcus turned around, expecting to see his parents or maybe another tourist. What he saw instead made his stomach drop. A tall man in a decorated military uniform was walking straight toward him. The man's chest was covered with medals and ribbons. His face was carved from stone, all sharp angles and serious lines. Behind him walked two more guards, and they looked even more intimidating than the one Marcus had been tormenting. The decorated officer stopped a few feet away from Marcus. His shadow fell across the boy like a dark curtain. When he spoke, his voice was deep and commanding, the kind of voice that expected immediate obedience. He asked Marcus a simple question. What did the boy think he was doing? But the way he asked it made Marcus's confidence crumble like a sandcastle hit by a wave. Marcus tried to speak, but his mouth had gone dry. The words that had flowed so easily moments ago now seemed stuck in his throat. He managed to stammer out something about just having fun, about not meaning any harm. His voice sounded small and pathetic even to his own ears. The officer didn't blink. He simply stood there waiting for a better answer. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Marcus could feel dozens of eyes on him now. The tourists who had been amused by his antics earlier were now watching with very different expressions. Some looked satisfied, as if justice was finally being served. Others looked pitying. Finally, the officer spoke again. He explained that the guard Marcus had been harassing was Sergeant James Mitchell. He had served in the Royal Guard for 15 years. Before that, he had been deployed overseas 3 times, where he had saved the lives of 6 fellow soldiers during an ambush. He had earned 2 medals for bravery and 1 for distinguished service. He had a wife and 2 daughters at home who depended on him. Marcus felt his face burning. He had never thought about the guard as a real person with a real life. The man had just been an object to him, a toy to play with when he was bored. The officer continued. He said that Sergeant Mitchell had shown remarkable restraint today, that most people would have lost their temper long ago, but the sergeant understood discipline. He understood duty. He understood that his job was to protect the palace and its visitors, even when those visitors didn't deserve protection. That last word stung. Marcus wanted to protest, to say that he did deserve protection, that his family was important, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the look in the officer's eyes. Maybe it was the growing realization that he had done something truly wrong. The officer introduced himself as Colonel Anderson, head of the Royal Guard. He said that he had been watching Marcus's behavior for the past 20 minutes. Someone had called him from inside the palace to report what was happening. He had come down immediately to address the situation. Colonel Anderson asked Marcus if he knew what respect meant. Marcus nodded quickly, eager to show that he understood basic concepts, but the colonel shook his head. He said that nodding wasn't enough. He wanted Marcus to explain it in his own words. Marcus struggled to find an answer. He said something about being polite and saying please and thank you. The colonel's expression suggested this answer was insufficient. The colonel explained that respect was about recognizing the humanity in others. It was about understanding that every person had value, regardless of their job or position in society. It was about treating people the way you would want to be treated. It was about acknowledging the sacrifices others made so that people like Marcus could live comfortable lives. Marcus felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them back furiously. He wouldn't cry in front of all these people. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But Colonel Anderson wasn't finished. He asked Marcus if he knew what it took to become a Royal Guard. Marcus shook his head, genuinely curious now despite his discomfort. The colonel began to describe the training process. Guards had to pass rigorous physical tests. They had to run 5 miles in under 40 minutes while carrying heavy equipment. They had to complete obstacle courses that would exhaust professional athletes. They had to spend weeks learning hand-to-hand combat techniques. But the physical training was only part of it, the colonel continued. Guards also had to study history, politics, and protocol. They had to learn emergency medical procedures. They had to practice remaining calm under extreme pressure. They had to prove they could be trusted with people's lives. Marcus listened, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He had thought the guards were just decoration, like the statues and fountains around the palace. He had never considered the work and dedication required to stand in that uniform. The colonel's voice softened slightly. He said that he understood Marcus was young, that young people sometimes made mistakes. But mistakes had consequences. Actions had ripples that spread out further than we could see. He gestured to the crowd that had gathered. He asked Marcus to look at their faces. Really look at them. What did Marcus see? Marcus forced himself to scan the crowd. He saw disappointment. He saw disgust. He saw some people shaking their heads. He saw parents using him as an example of what not to do, pointing at him while lecturing their own children. He saw phone cameras still recording, capturing his shame for the whole world to see. The colonel said that Marcus had not just disrespected Sergeant Mitchell today. He had disrespected the entire Royal Guard. He had disrespected the palace. He had disrespected the values of service and sacrifice that these guards represented. And he had disrespected himself by showing everyone present what kind of person he was. Those words hit Marcus harder than anything else. What kind of person was he? An hour ago he would have said he was special, important, better than most. Now he wasn't so sure. Colonel Anderson asked Marcus what he thought should happen next. Should they call his parents? Should they ban his family from ever visiting the palace again? Should they report this incident to the authorities? Since technically Marcus had committed harassment and vandalism by damaging the sergeant's uniform, Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. His parents would be furious. His father's business relationships could be damaged. His mother would never forgive him for embarrassing the family. The thought of being banned from the palace, of having this incident become official, was terrifying. He looked up at the colonel with wide eyes and finally managed to speak clearly. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't want any of those things to happen. He said he would do anything to make it right. The colonel studied him for a long moment. Then he said that sorry was a start, but it wasn't enough. Words were easy. Actions were what mattered. If Marcus truly wanted to make amends, he would need to do more than just apologize. He proposed something that made Marcus's blood run cold. Colonel Anderson said that Marcus would spend the next week volunteering with the Royal Guard. Every day after school, Marcus would report to the Guard headquarters. He would clean the barracks, polish boots, organize equipment, and assist with whatever tasks the guards needed done. He would learn what it meant to serve others instead of expecting to be served. Marcus wanted to refuse. The idea of spending his free time doing manual labor was horrible. But one look at the colonel's face told him that refusal wasn't an option. This was the lighter punishment. The alternative was much worse. The colonel added one more condition. Marcus would write a formal letter of apology to Sergeant Mitchell. Not just a few quick sentences, but a real letter explaining what he had learned and why his behavior was wrong. The sergeant would decide whether the apology was sincere enough to accept. Marcus nodded miserably. He had no choice but to agree. Colonel Anderson then did something unexpected. He called Sergeant Mitchell over. The guard walked up and stood at attention, his face still showing no emotion. The colonel told the sergeant that he was dismissed from his post for the rest of the day. He had earned a break after showing such remarkable professionalism. As the sergeant walked away, Marcus noticed something. The man had a slight limp. It was barely visible, but it was there. Marcus wondered if it was from an old injury. From one of those overseas deployments the colonel had mentioned. He felt another wave of shame wash over him. The colonel dismissed the crowd, telling everyone that the situation was handled. People slowly dispersed, though many threw final glances at Marcus. Some of those glances were sympathetic now, others were still judgmental. Marcus couldn't tell which was worse. Before leaving, Colonel Anderson handed Marcus a card with an address and a phone number. He was expected to report there the next day at 4 in the afternoon. If he was even 1 minute late, the deal was off and harsher consequences would follow. Marcus took the card with shaking hands. The colonel's final words were softer but somehow more impactful. He said that privilege was a gift, but it came with responsibility. People who had advantages in life had a duty to use those advantages wisely and to treat others with dignity. The measure of a person wasn't what they had, but how they treated those who had less. Then Colonel Anderson walked away, his medals glinting in the afternoon sun. Marcus stood alone in the courtyard, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. He found his parents 20 minutes later in one of the palace's meeting rooms. They were finishing up their business discussions, laughing with important-looking people in expensive suits. Marcus's father saw him and waved him over, asking if he had enjoyed exploring the grounds. Marcus opened his mouth to tell them everything, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what had happened? How could he admit that he had been so cruel and stupid? His parents thought he was mature for his age, responsible and smart. What would they think if they knew the truth? He decided to wait. He would tell them later when they got home. Right now, he just wanted to leave this place and forget this day had ever happened. But that night, lying in his enormous bedroom surrounded by his expensive things, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the sergeant's face, kept hearing the colonel's words, kept feeling the weight of all those disappointed stares. He got up and sat at his desk. He pulled out a piece of paper and started writing the apology letter. He wrote several versions, crumpling up page after page and throwing them in the trash. Nothing sounded right. Everything seemed fake or insufficient. Finally, around midnight, he managed to write something that felt honest. He explained that he had been cruel and thoughtless, that he had treated the sergeant like he wasn't a real person with feelings and a life, that he was ashamed of his behavior and wanted to do better, that he was grateful for the chance to learn from his mistakes instead of just being punished. He sealed the letter in an envelope and set it on his desk. Then he lay back down and stared at the ceiling, wondering what the next week would bring. The next day at school dragged on forever. Marcus couldn't focus on his classes. His mind kept drifting to the afternoon and what awaited him at the guard headquarters. His friends noticed he was distracted and asked what was wrong. He made up some excuse about not feeling well. When the final bell rang, Marcus felt his stomach twist with anxiety. He thought about just going home. The colonel would never know. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he couldn't do it. Something had changed in him yesterday. He had seen himself through other people's eyes and hadn't liked what he saw. He took a bus to the address on the card. The guard headquarters was a large stone building on the edge of the palace grounds. It looked intimidating and official. Marcus stood outside for a full minute, gathering his courage before finally walking up to the door. Inside, he was met by a stern-faced woman in uniform. She checked his name against a list and nodded. She said the colonel was expecting him. She led him through several hallways, each one lined with photos of guards in various situations. Some photos showed formal ceremonies. Others showed guards helping during natural disasters or protecting civilians during emergencies. Marcus realized that these guards did more than just stand at palace gates. They were first responders. They were protectors. They were servants of the people in the truest sense. The woman stopped at a door and knocked twice. A voice from inside called for them to enter. Marcus took a deep breath and walked into Colonel Anderson's office. The colonel sat behind a simple wooden desk. The room was neat and organized, with bookshelves lining one wall and a large map on another. He gestured for Marcus to sit in the chair across from him. The colonel asked if Marcus had brought the letter. Marcus handed over the envelope with trembling hands. The colonel opened it and read slowly, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes, he folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer. He said the letter was acceptable. Sergeant Mitchell would read it when he returned to duty. But the real test would be the week ahead. Words on paper were easy. Following through with action was harder. The colonel stood up and told Marcus to follow him. It was time to begin. Colonel Anderson led Marcus through the headquarters to a large room filled with equipment. Uniforms hung on racks. Boots lined the walls in neat rows. There were helmets, belts, and various pieces of gear that Marcus couldn't identify. The smell of leather polish filled the air. A young guard named Private Chen was waiting for them. He looked to be in his early 20s with a friendly face but serious eyes. The colonel explained that Private Chen would supervise Marcus's work for the week. Then he left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Private Chen handed Marcus an apron and a pair of work gloves. He pointed to a table covered with dirty boots and said that would be Marcus's first task. Each pair needed to be cleaned thoroughly and polished until they shined. There were at least 30 pairs on the table. Marcus stared at the boots in dismay. He had never polished shoes in his life. At home, his mother sent his expensive sneakers out to be professionally cleaned. The idea of scrubbing dirt off someone else's boots seemed beneath him. But he had agreed to this, so he picked up a boot and a rag and started working. It was harder than it looked. The dirt was caked on thick in some places. His arms started aching after just the first few pairs. Private Chen watched him work, occasionally offering tips on technique but mostly staying quiet. The young guard's presence was intimidating in a different way than the colonel's had been. Chen didn't need to say much. His steady gaze was enough to keep Marcus focused. An hour passed. Then 2. Marcus's back hurt from bending over the table. His hands were cramping. He had only finished about half the boots, and they didn't look as shiny as the ones the guards wore. He was starting to understand that perfection took time and effort. Private Chen finally spoke. He said that physical labor built character. It taught patience and attention to detail. He asked Marcus if he knew why the guards kept their uniforms and equipment so clean. Marcus shook his head, grateful for the break. Chen explained that maintaining equipment was about more than appearance. It was about discipline and pride. When a guard put on a clean, perfectly maintained uniform, he was reminded of what he represented. The uniform was a symbol of service, and treating it with care showed respect for that service. Marcus had never thought about clothes that way. To him, clothes were just fashion statements or status symbols, something to show off or throw away when they went out of style. The idea that clothing could mean something deeper was foreign but interesting. They finished the boots as the sun began to set outside the windows. Private Chen inspected each pair carefully. He pointed out several that needed more work. Marcus felt frustrated but also determined. He went back and redid those boots, putting extra effort into making them perfect. When Chen finally approved the last pair, Marcus felt a strange sense of accomplishment. His hands were sore and his back ached, but he had completed the task. He had done something useful, but the day wasn't over. Private Chen led him to another room where laundry was piled high. Uniforms that needed to be washed, dried, folded, and organized. Marcus's heart sank, but he didn't complain. He set to work. By the time he was allowed to leave, it was nearly 8 at night. Marcus had missed dinner. His whole body hurt. He was exhausted in a way he had never experienced before. But as he rode the bus home, he realized something surprising. He felt more awake and aware than he had in months. At home, his parents asked where he had been. Marcus finally told them everything, about harassing the guard, about getting caught, about the punishment. He expected them to be angry or to try to get him out of it. His father had connections after all. But his father surprised him. After a long silence, he said that the colonel was right, that Marcus needed to learn this lesson. His mother agreed, though she looked worried about her son doing manual labor. They told Marcus he would fulfill his obligation to the guard, and that they would discuss his behavior and attitude more deeply once the week was over. Marcus went to bed that night feeling oddly relieved. He had expected his parents to either rage at him or rescue him. Instead, they had supported the punishment. It made him think that maybe they had been worried about him too, about the person he was becoming. The second day was harder than the first. His muscles were sore from the previous day's work, and he had to push through the pain. Private Chen had him cleaning the barracks, scrubbing floors and windows. It was tedious, repetitive work that made his hands raw. But as he cleaned, something began to shift in Marcus's mind. He started paying attention to the details around him, the photos on the walls showing guards helping during floods and earthquakes, the memorial plaques honoring guards who had died in service, the neat, simple way everything was organized, nothing wasted or excessive. During a break, Private Chen shared his own story. He had grown up poor in a rough neighborhood. Joining the Royal Guard had been his way out, his chance to build a better life. The training had been brutal, and there were many times he wanted to quit. But he had pushed through, and now he had a career he was proud of, a purpose that mattered. Marcus listened, really listened. He had never heard anyone talk about their job with such genuine pride. In his world, people worked to make money or gain status. The idea of working for purpose and meaning was new to him. On the third day, Colonel Anderson visited while Marcus was working. He watched silently for a few minutes, then asked Marcus what he had learned so far. Marcus struggled to put it into words. He talked about how hard physical work was, how much effort went into maintaining the guard headquarters, how dedicated people like Private Chen were. The colonel nodded, but said Marcus was still missing the bigger picture. These tasks weren't just about keeping things clean. They were about understanding that every job mattered, that the person who polished the boots was just as important as the person who wore them, that society functioned because people at all levels did their parts with dignity and skill. He told Marcus about a saying from ancient times. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. Small things mattered. People who did small things mattered. Marcus thought about this as he returned to his work. He thought about all the people he had dismissed in his life. Service workers, cleaners, drivers, people he barely noticed because they weren't rich or powerful. He wondered how many of them had stories like Private Chen. How many of them worked with the same quiet dedication he was witnessing here. By the fourth day, Marcus was getting better at the work. His hands had developed calluses, and his muscles had adjusted to the physical demands. He worked faster now, and his results were cleaner and more thorough. Private Chen commented on his improvement, which gave Marcus an unexpected boost of confidence. That afternoon, something happened that changed Marcus's entire perspective. A group of new recruits arrived for their first day of training. They looked nervous and excited, just like Marcus had been nervous his first day. But their nervousness came from anticipation of serving, not from punishment. Private Chen told Marcus to take a break and watch the recruits' orientation. Colonel Anderson was giving them a speech about what it meant to be a Royal Guard. Marcus sat in the back of the room unnoticed and listened. The colonel talked about sacrifice and service. He explained that being a guard meant putting others before yourself. It meant standing in the heat and cold for hours to make people feel safe. It meant being ready to face danger at any moment to protect the innocent. It meant accepting that you would never be famous or widely recognized, but that your work would matter immensely to the people you served. He told the recruits that they would be tested in ways they couldn't imagine, that they would want to quit many times, that they would question whether it was worth it. But if they pushed through, they would discover something valuable. They would discover who they really were. They would discover that they were capable of more than they ever thought possible. Marcus felt tears pricking his eyes as he listened. The colonel was describing a kind of courage that Marcus had never considered. Not the courage to do something flashy or impressive, but the courage to show up every day and do difficult, often thankless work, because it was right. When the speech ended, the recruits stood and saluted. There was fire in their eyes. They were ready to begin their journey. Marcus felt a strange mixture of envy and admiration. These people had chosen this path. They wanted to serve. Meanwhile, he had spent his life taking everything for granted. After the recruits left for their first training session, Colonel Anderson approached Marcus. He asked if the speech had resonated with him. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. The colonel said that Marcus was lucky in some ways. He had wealth and advantages that most people would never have. But those advantages came with a danger. They could make him soft. They could make him forget that real strength came from character, not from money or status. They could isolate him from understanding how most people lived. He said that this week wasn't really about punishment. It was about perspective. It was about showing Marcus a different way of seeing the world, a way that valued contribution over consumption, effort over entitlement, service over selfishness. Marcus asked the colonel why he was being so patient with him. Why go to all this trouble for one spoiled kid who had made a mistake? The colonel could have just banned him from the palace or reported him to his parents. This elaborate lesson seemed like more work than Marcus deserved. The colonel smiled for the first time that week. He said that he had seen potential in Marcus. Yes, the boy had behaved terribly, but when confronted, he had taken responsibility. He had shown up every day this week without complaint. He had worked hard and tried to learn. Those were signs of someone who could change, who could grow into a better person. The colonel explained that he believed in giving people chances. Not endless chances, but real ones. One of his own sons had been a troubled teenager. Angry, disrespectful, heading down a bad path. But someone had taken the time to mentor him, to show him a different way. That son was now a teacher helping at-risk youth. The colonel was paying that kindness forward. This conversation stayed with Marcus as he returned to his work. Someone believed he could be better. Not his parents, who loved him but also indulged him. Not his teachers, who saw him as another wealthy student passing through. But this stern colonel, who had every reason to write him off, had chosen to invest time in teaching him. On the 5th day, Marcus met Sergeant Mitchell for the first time since the incident. The sergeant had returned to duty and was at the headquarters for a briefing. When he saw Marcus cleaning equipment in the corner, he walked over. Marcus's hands started shaking. He didn't know what to say. He mumbled an apology, his face burning with shame. The sergeant listened quietly, then did something unexpected. He extended his hand for a handshake. The sergeant said he had read Marcus's letter. He said it took courage to admit you were wrong and to actually try to change. He said he had accepted the apology. And he said that if Marcus ever wanted to talk about what guards actually did, he would be happy to explain. Marcus shook the sergeant's hand, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. This man he had tormented had shown him grace and forgiveness. It was more than Marcus felt he deserved, which made it all the more powerful. They talked for nearly half an hour. The sergeant explained his work in detail, how he had trained for years to reach his position, how he had served overseas not in combat but in peacekeeping missions, helping rebuild communities after conflicts, how he had been injured when a building collapsed during a rescue operation, which explained the limp Marcus had noticed, how he had recovered and returned to service because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. The sergeant showed Marcus photos of his family. His wife was a nurse. His daughters were 9 and 11, both interested in science. He talked about them with such obvious love and pride that Marcus felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just some random guard. This was a father, a husband, a hero in his own quiet way, and Marcus had treated him like garbage. The sergeant must have seen the guilt on Marcus's face because he said something that Marcus would never forget. He said that mistakes were part of being human. What mattered was what you did after the mistake. Did you make excuses? Did you blame others? Or did you own it and try to become better? The choice defined who you were. That evening, as Marcus prepared to leave for the day, Private Chen stopped him. He said that tomorrow would be Marcus's last day. He asked if Marcus felt different than he had at the start of the week. Marcus thought about it. He said he felt tired and sore, but also more awake somehow, like he had been sleepwalking through life and was finally starting to wake up. Chen smiled and said that was exactly how he had felt during his own training. Marcus went home that night and looked around his bedroom with new eyes. At all his expensive things that he had thought made him special. Now they just seemed like stuff. Objects that would eventually break or become outdated. They didn't define him. They didn't make him valuable. Only his actions and character could do that. He thought about the recruits he had watched earlier that week. Young people choosing to dedicate themselves to serving others. He thought about Sergeant Mitchell limping but still showing up, still doing his duty. He thought about Private Chen, who had escaped poverty through discipline and dedication. He thought about Colonel Anderson, who could have taken the easy path and just punished Marcus harshly, but instead had chosen to teach him. For the first time in his life, Marcus understood what it meant to be humbled. Not humiliated, but humbled. There was a difference. Humiliation was being torn down. Being humbled was realizing you weren't as high up as you thought, and that was actually okay. Because true worth didn't come from being above others. It came from standing alongside them and recognizing their value. The sixth and final day arrived. Marcus woke up earlier than usual, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the hard physical work would be ending. Sadness that he would be leaving a place where he had learned so much. He arrived at the headquarters 15 minutes early. Private Chen was already there, as always. He greeted Marcus with a nod of respect that felt different from the cautious acknowledgement of the first day. This nod suggested that Marcus had earned something through his efforts. The final day's tasks were lighter. Marcus spent the morning helping to organize the supply room, cataloging equipment and ensuring everything was in its proper place. It was detail-oriented work that required focus and patience. Marcus found himself taking pride in doing it correctly. During lunch, several guards stopped by to say goodbye. Word had spread about the boy who was volunteering as penance for his disrespect. Some guards had been skeptical that Marcus would last the week. Others had been curious to see if he would actually change. Many seemed genuinely impressed that he had stuck it out. One older guard, a man with gray hair and weathered hands, pulled Marcus aside. He said he had been watching Marcus work all week. He said most wealthy kids in Marcus's position would have complained, would have had their parents get them out of it, would have done the bare minimum. But Marcus had shown real effort. That meant something. The guard shared his own story. He had grown up privileged, much like Marcus. As a young man, he had been arrogant and careless. Then he had made a serious mistake that hurt someone he cared about. It had been a wake-up call. He had joined the guard to learn discipline and to serve something greater than himself. That had been 40 years ago, and he had never regretted it. He told Marcus that this week was just the beginning. The real challenge would be taking these lessons back into his regular life. It was easy to be humble when you were scrubbing floors and polishing boots. It was harder to maintain that humility when you were surrounded by luxury and privilege again. But that was where true character showed itself. In the afternoon, Colonel Anderson called Marcus to his office for the final time. Marcus sat in the same chair he had occupied on the first day, but everything felt different now. He felt different. The colonel asked Marcus to reflect on the week. What had he learned? Marcus took his time answering. He talked about learning the value of hard work, about understanding that every person's contribution mattered, about seeing that real strength came from character, not from money or status, about recognizing that he had been living in a bubble, disconnected from how most people experience the world. But more than that, Marcus said, he had learned about service, about what it meant to do something not because it benefited you, but because it helped others. He had seen that kind of service in every guard he had met, in Private Chen, who could have treated him harshly but instead had been patient, in Sergeant Mitchell, who had forgiven him, in the colonel himself, who had taken time from his busy schedule to teach one foolish boy a lesson. The colonel listened intently, then nodded. He said that Marcus had grasped the core lesson, but he cautioned that understanding something intellectually was different from living it daily. The true test would come in the weeks and months ahead. He gave Marcus a challenge. He said that privilege came with responsibility. Marcus had advantages most people would never have. The question was what he would do with those advantages. Would he use them only for himself, or would he use them to make a positive difference in the world? The colonel suggested some concrete steps. Marcus could volunteer regularly, not because he was being punished, but because it was the right thing to do. He could treat service workers with respect and recognition. He could stand up to friends who looked down on others. He could choose to use his family's resources to help people who needed it. Small actions multiplied over time created big changes. Marcus promised he would try. The colonel smiled and said that trying was all anyone could ask. He stood and shook Marcus's hand man to man as an equal. Then he handed Marcus a certificate. It was simple, just a piece of paper with the Royal Guard seal. It stated that Marcus Wellington had completed a week of service with the Royal Guard and had shown dedication and growth. The colonel said Marcus should keep this certificate as a reminder. On days when he was tempted to fall back into old patterns, he should look at it and remember this week. Remember what he had learned. Remember the person he had discovered he could be. Marcus left the headquarters that evening feeling transformed. The physical exhaustion from the week had been replaced by a different kind of tiredness. A good tired. The tired that came from honest effort and meaningful work. Over the following weeks, Marcus made changes in his life. Small ones at first. He started saying thank you to bus drivers and cashiers. actually making eye contact and meaning it. He volunteered at a local food bank on weekends. When his friends made fun of people they considered beneath them, Marcus spoke up, explaining why that attitude was wrong. His friends thought he had changed. Some drifted away, uncomfortable with this new version of Marcus who actually cared about things beyond video games and status symbols. But others stayed, and a few even seemed inspired to make their own changes. At school, Marcus noticed people he had never paid attention to before. The janitor who cleaned their classrooms every evening. The lunch staff who prepared their meals. The security guard at the front entrance. He made an effort to learn their names to acknowledge them as people. His relationship with his parents evolved too. They had long conversations about values and what truly mattered. His father admitted that he had sometimes set a poor example, treating employees as less important than clients or partners. He said seeing Marcus change had made him reflect on his own behavior. 3 months after his week with the Royal Guard, Marcus returned to the palace. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He brought coffee and pastries for the guards on duty. Sergeant Mitchell was there, and he greeted Marcus with a genuine smile. They talked for a while. The sergeant asked how Marcus had been doing, what changes he had made. Marcus shared his experiences with volunteering and his efforts to treat people better. The sergeant said he was proud of him, and Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest. Earning this man's respect meant more than any trophy or award ever had. Colonel Anderson appeared while they were talking. He observed Marcus for a moment, then invited him to join a tour he was giving to a group of school students. The tour explained the role of the Royal Guard and the values they represented. Marcus walked with the group, listening to the colonel explain the same things he had taught Marcus through direct experience. But now Marcus could add his own perspective. When students asked questions, he found himself answering some of them, sharing what he had learned. One young boy asked if being a guard was boring. Marcus thought about his first impression of Sergeant Mitchell standing at his post. How he had thought the man was just decoration, just a statue to mock. He smiled and explained that he had once thought the same thing. Then he told them about the training, the dedication, the purpose that drove these men and women. He told them that the guards were anything but boring. They were some of the most interesting people he had ever met. After the tour, the colonel pulled Marcus aside. He said that Marcus had done well, that his growth over the past months was evident. He said something else too. He said that if Marcus ever wanted to volunteer with the Guard in a more formal capacity, helping with community outreach or youth programs, he would be welcome. Marcus was surprised. He asked if the colonel was serious. The colonel said absolutely. Marcus had made a mistake, but he had owned it and grown from it. That was exactly the kind of story that could inspire other young people. The kind of transformation that could make a real difference. Marcus said he would think about it. And he did over the following days. Eventually, he decided to accept. He started volunteering one afternoon a week, helping organize community events and talking to school groups about respect, service, and personal growth. It wasn't always easy. There were days when Marcus wanted to sleep in instead of volunteering, days when his old habits tried to resurface, days when standing up for what was right felt uncomfortable or awkward. But he kept coming back to that week at the Guard headquarters, kept remembering the certificate in his drawer, kept hearing Colonel Anderson's words about who he could choose to be. Years later, when Marcus was applying to universities, he wrote his main essay about this experience, about being a spoiled child who had crossed the line, about the powerful lesson he had learned, about how one week had changed the trajectory of his entire life. He wrote about understanding that everyone has value, that real strength comes from character, that privilege is a responsibility, not an excuse, that service to others gives life meaning in a way that selfishness never can. The essay helped him get into his top choice school, but more importantly, the experience had helped him become someone he was proud to be, someone who saw people, really saw them, and treated them with the dignity they deserved. Marcus never forgot Sergeant Mitchell, Private Chen, or Colonel Anderson. They had been his teachers in a way that no classroom instructor ever could be. They had shown him what it meant to be a